The richest homes are not the ones with the tallest walls, but the ones where someone still waits for you at the dinner table. The first light of an October morning spilled gently across the sprawling Montgomery estate, turning its white stone facade into a masterpiece of gold and amber, while the surrounding maple trees surrendered their crimson leaves to the cool autumn breeze. The mansion overlooked the Hudson River from its quiet hilltop, a symbol of extraordinary success admired by business magazines across the country. Yet behind its towering iron gates and sparkling fountains lived a silence that no amount of money had ever managed to repair. Every room reflected perfection. Crystal chandeliers glowed above polished marble floors. Priceless paintings lined endless hallways. Antique clocks marked every passing minute with flawless precision. But the house no longer sounded like a home. Staff members moved carefully from room to room, speaking in hushed voices as though afraid that laughter itself no longer belonged there. Even breakfast was served without conversation. At 38, Adrian Montgomery had built one of the nation's fastest-growing investment companies, earning a reputation as a brilliant millionaire who never accepted failure. His decisions shaped industries, influenced markets, and created thousands of jobs. Yet every morning before leaving for work, he climbed the grand staircase to check on the only opinion that still mattered to him. Harold Montgomery, his 76-year-old father, sat quietly beside the bedroom window, wrapped in a gray wool sweater, staring toward the gardens where his late wife once spent every afternoon tending roses. Since losing her 2 years earlier, Harold had slowly withdrawn from the world around him. Doctors found nothing seriously wrong with his health, but he refused to enjoy the simple routines that had once filled his days with purpose. He barely touched his meals. He rarely left his room. The laughter that once echoed through the estate had disappeared with his beloved Eleanor. Adrian placed a fresh cup of coffee beside his father and gently asked, "Will you come downstairs today?" Harold offered, only a faint smile before turning back toward the window. Perhaps tomorrow. It was the same answer he had given for months. Later that afternoon, Adrian met with the household staff in the mansion's elegant dining room. Another resignation letter rested on the polished oak table. The 23rd chef had quietly packed his bags before sunrise. He said Mr. Harold would not eat, the elderly butler explained with visible disappointment. Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment. Michelin-starred chefs had failed. Celebrity nutritionists had failed. Private caregivers had failed. Every person arrived believing expensive ingredients could solve a broken heart. Every person eventually left. "Is there anyone else?" Adrian asked. The estate manager hesitated before sliding one final application across the table. "One candidate remains. Her references are excellent, but she has never worked in a private estate." Adrian glanced at the simple resume. Zuri Carter, age 30, community kitchen coordinator, volunteer cook, no luxury hotels, no famous restaurants, no prestigious culinary awards. Why was she recommended? He asked. Because every family she ever cooked for asked if she could stay. Adrian looked up thoughtfully. An hour later, the massive front doors opened with a soft echo as cool autumn air drifted into the entrance hall. A beautiful black woman stepped inside, carrying a worn canvas bag and an old leather recipe notebook whose edges had softened with years of careful use. She wore a modest brown coat, comfortable shoes, and a quiet confidence that required no introduction. Several members of the household staff exchanged knowing glances. One whispered that she looked too ordinary for a place like this. Another quietly predicted she would leave before the weekend. The elderly butler simply smiled with gentle sympathy, remembering every talented chef who had walked through those same doors believing skill alone could heal grief. Zuri thanked him warmly before looking around the magnificent entrance hall. She admired neither the marble staircase nor the crystal chandelier. Instead, her eyes searched for the kitchen. At the top of the staircase, Adrian watched silently from the second-floor balcony. He had expected another polished professional carrying expensive knives and endless confidence. Instead, he found a woman carrying an old recipe book against her heart, as though it contained something far more valuable than any culinary certificate. Their eyes met across the grand foyer for only a few seconds, but neither looked away. In that quiet moment, while golden sunlight poured through towering windows and autumn leaves drifted across the front steps, neither Adrian nor Zuri realized that the greatest change inside the Montgomery estate would begin long before anyone tasted a single meal. The Montgomery estate awakened before sunrise as it always did, with quiet footsteps echoing across polished marble floors and the distant ticking of antique clocks marking another orderly morning. Yet there was a subtle difference in the air. For the first time in months, someone new stood inside the enormous kitchen before the rest of the household had arrived. Zuri Carter slowly placed her worn leather recipe notebook on the wide oak counter and looked around the professional kitchen that gleamed beneath warm pendant lights. Every surface reflected perfection. Copper cookware hung in flawless rows. Imported spices filled elegant glass jars. Expensive appliances waited silently for instructions. It was one of the finest kitchens she had ever seen, yet it felt strangely unfamiliar. There were no handwritten notes taped inside cabinet doors. No favorite coffee mug resting beside the stove. No signs that anyone had cooked there with love. It was beautiful, but it did not feel lived in. The elderly butler entered carrying a tray of fresh ingredients before quietly introducing himself. "My name is Charles. Mr. Harold has refused breakfast every morning for nearly 6 months. Please do not take it personally if today is no different." Zuri thanked him with a gentle smile instead of asking questions. She opened her recipe notebook carefully, revealing pages softened by years of use and stained with tiny reminders of family meals prepared long ago. Between two recipes rested a faded photograph of her grandmother standing beside. A cast-iron stove with flour on her apron enjoyed her eyes. Zuri smiled at the memory before placing the picture safely back inside the notebook. Rather than selecting expensive ingredients from the imported pantry, she gathered simple vegetables, fresh herbs from the greenhouse, homemade chicken stock, onions, celery, carrots, and a loaf of fresh country bread baked that morning by the estate bakery. One of the younger kitchen assistants watched curiously. "Are you making soup?" he asked with obvious surprise. "Mr. Harold has been served dishes prepared by award-winning chefs." Zuri nodded while carefully slicing carrots into even pieces. "Sometimes people stop missing food," she answered softly, "because what they truly miss is the person who once placed it on the table." Butter slowly melted inside the heavy pot, filling the room with a warm aroma that quietly spread through the kitchen. The onions softened into sweetness before celery and carrots joined them, followed by fragrant thyme and rosemary freshly picked from the garden. As the broth began to simmer, the comforting scent drifted through nearby hallways. Housekeepers passing outside the kitchen slowed their steps almost without noticing. One maid smiled unexpectedly. "It smells like my mother's kitchen," she whispered. Upstairs, Harold remained seated beside the bedroom window, gazing toward the rose garden where Eleanor had once spent countless afternoons. A breakfast tray rested untouched beside him exactly as it had every morning before. Charles approached gently. "Sir, the new cook has prepared something for you." Harold did not even look toward the tray. "Please thank her for trying." Downstairs, Charles quietly repeated the response. Zuri simply nodded. She ladled the finished soup into a plain white bowl instead of elegant china, added one slice of buttered country bread, and placed the tray on a small table outside the library rather than bringing it directly to Harold's room. "Will you not serve him?" Charles asked. "No, suridi plaid gamli." People who have lost so much deserve the dignity of making at least one choice for themselves. She stepped away without another word. Several minutes later, Harold slowly walked past the library doorway and paused. The familiar fragrance stopped him in his tracks. It was not the scent of luxury. It was the scent of home. His eyes quietly filled as memories of Eleanor standing beside their first tiny stove drifted gently back into his heart. Without anyone asking him to eat, Harold reached for the spoon. From his second-floor balcony, Adrian happened to witness the moment. He watched his father lift the first spoonful to his lips, then another, until the bowl was completely empty. For the first time in many months, hope did not arrive through wealth, influence, or medicine. It arrived quietly in the form of a simple bowl of soup prepared by the one woman everyone expected to fail. The following morning, the Montgomery estate awakened beneath a blanket of soft autumn mist that drifted gently across the gardens, wrapping the rose bushes in pale silver while the Hudson River shimmered quietly beyond the trees. Inside the mansion, the familiar routine continued with polished precision. Housekeepers arranged fresh flowers in crystal vases. The groundskeepers trimmed hedges with careful attention, and the butler supervised breakfast preparations with his usual quiet dignity. Yet something invisible had shifted since the previous evening. People who had once walked through the hallways with lowered eyes now paused to exchange small smiles. Even the silence sounded different, as though it had begun making room for something warmer. Zuri arrived in the kitchen before sunrise once again, tying on her simple apron while opening the old leather recipe notebook that had accompanied her through every chapter of her life. She ran her fingertips gently across a handwritten recipe before closing the book with quiet gratitude. She never measured success by compliments or applause. She measured it by whether someone chose to sit at the table one more time. Charles entered carrying a basket filled with fresh herbs from the estate greenhouse. "Mr. Harold requested breakfast downstairs this morning," he said with obvious amazement. Zuri paused only long enough to smile. "Then we should make breakfast worth waking up for." She prepared warm oatmeal with cinnamon and baked apples, fresh scrambled eggs with garden herbs, homemade biscuits, and strawberry preserves made from fruit harvested during the summer. The comforting aromas slowly filled the kitchen before drifting toward the grand dining room. Upstairs, Adrian adjusted the cuffs of his navy suit before leaving for another day of meetings, but instead of finding his father sitting alone beside the bedroom window, he discovered the room empty. For a brief moment, concern crossed his face. Then he heard quiet conversation echoing faintly from downstairs. Following the sound, Adrian stopped just outside the dining room doorway. Harold was already seated at the long oak table with a warm cup of coffee resting beside him. He had not chosen that chair by accident. It was the place where Eleanor had always insisted the family begin every morning together. Zuri placed breakfast before him without ceremony or unnecessary words. Harold looked up with a gentle smile. "You somehow knew Eleanor always sprinkled a little cinnamon on the apples." Zuri folded the linen napkin beside his plate before answering softly. "Some recipes tell you how to cook. Others tell you how someone loved." Harold lowered his eyes, quietly moved by the thought. Adrian remained unnoticed at the doorway, watching his father finish nearly every bite on the plate. It was not simply the meal that surprised him. It was the expression on Harold's face. For the first time in years, there was curiosity instead of resignation, gratitude instead of absence. After breakfast, Harold surprised everyone again by asking Charles to unlock the greenhouse. "The roses will need attention before winter," he said. Charles nearly laughed with relief as he hurried to retrieve the keys. Later that afternoon, Zuri walked through the mansion, carrying a small basket of herbs for dinner. Along the way, she greeted every employee by name after hearing each introduction only once. She thanked the gardener for caring so faithfully for Eleanor's favorite flowers. She complimented one young maid on the beautiful arrangement of autumn leaves in the entrance hall. She noticed a maintenance worker quietly repairing a loose cabinet hinge and thanked him for protecting a house filled with memories instead of simply fixing furniture. None of her words were dramatic. They were simply sincere. Adrian watched each interaction from a distance while reviewing documents on his tablet, gradually realizing that people smiled differently after speaking with her. They stood a little taller. They laughed a little more freely. The mansion itself seemed to breathe more deeply than it had in years. That evening, Harold surprised Adrian once again. Instead of asking for his dinner to be served privately, he quietly looked toward his son and said, "Would you stay and eat with me tonight?" Adrian hesitated only for a heartbeat before nodding. As he took his seat across the table, he glanced toward Zuri, arranging fresh bread in the center of the dining table beneath the warm glow of the chandelier. He suddenly understood that she had not come to change recipes. She had quietly begun changing relationships, one meal at a time. The rhythm of life inside the Montgomery estate continued changing so quietly that no one noticed the exact day it happened. It was as though warmth had slowly seeped into the old walls, one conversation, one shared meal, and one thoughtful gesture at a time. The mansion that had once echoed with silence now carried the gentle sounds of ordinary life. Fresh bread baked every morning. Soft jazz played from an old radio while the kitchen staff prepared lunch. Housekeepers no longer hurried through endless hallways with anxious expressions, but paused to admire the late autumn sunlight spilling across polished wooden floors. Even the grandfather clock in the entrance hall seemed less lonely as each passing hour welcomed another small moment of togetherness. Harold spent more time downstairs than anyone could remember. Every morning after breakfast, he wandered into the greenhouse, carrying a small pair of gardening gloves that had belonged to Eleanor. He carefully trimmed rose bushes, watered herbs, and smiled whenever Zuri stopped beside him to ask about the flowers his wife had loved most. She always believed roses bloomed better when someone spoke kindly to them, Harold said with a gentle laugh one afternoon. Zuri knelt beside a bed of lavender and smiled. Then I think she would have loved this garden. Everyone here has started speaking more kindly. Harold looked toward the mansion where sunlight reflected from the tall windows. Not only the garden, he whispered. The people, too. Adrian noticed the changes everywhere he looked. Employees who once avoided eye contact now greeted one another by name. The young kitchen assistants shared family recipes while preparing dinner. Charles laughed openly with the gardeners over afternoon coffee. For years, Adrian had believed leadership meant efficiency, discipline, and results. Watching the estate transform, he began to understand that genuine leadership also created belonging. One evening, Adrian returned from an exhausting day of meetings, expecting to find another quiet dinner waiting in the formal dining room. Instead, he stopped in surprise. Harold and Zuri were arranging candles together while Charles carried warm bread to the table. The room no longer resembled the elegant but lifeless dining hall he had grown accustomed to. Fresh flowers from the greenhouse decorated the center of the table. Soft piano music drifted through hidden speakers. The rich aroma of roasted vegetables, herb chicken, and homemade rolls welcomed him before anyone spoke. Harold looked up with a smile Adrian had not seen in years. "You're just in time," he said. "Dinner tastes better when no chair is empty." Adrian slowly removed his suit jacket and took his place across from his father without checking his phone for the first time in months. During the meal, Harold began telling stories about Eleanor that Adrian had never heard before. He spoke about their tiny first apartment, the nights they survived on simple vegetable soup while saving money, and the old wooden table where every important family conversation had taken place. Zuri listened with quiet attention, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that encouraged Harold to remember details he had long kept hidden inside his heart. Adrian realized something remarkable. His father was not merely eating again. He was living again. After dinner, Harold excused himself to rest while Adrian remained behind helping clear the table. As he stacked the empty plates beside the sink, he glanced toward Zuri washing vegetables for the following morning. "I have spent years trying to solve every problem with money," he admitted quietly. "Yet nothing I purchased brought my father back to us." Zuri gently dried her hands before looking at him. "People do not always need something expensive," she answered. "Sometimes they only need someone willing to sit beside them long enough to remind them they still matter." Adrian stood silently for several moments, allowing those words to settle inside him. Looking around the softly lit kitchen filled with the comforting scent of cinnamon and fresh herbs, he suddenly understood that the greatest change inside the Montgomery estate had never begun with a recipe. It had begun the moment one woman chose to care about people before she cared about perfection. And somewhere deep within his own heart, Adrian realized he was beginning to look forward to coming home more than he looked forward to succeeding anywhere else. November settled gently over the Hudson Valley, painting the hills beyond the Montgomery estate in deep shades of amber and bronze, while cool evening breezes carried the comforting scent of wood smoke through the gardens. Life inside the mansion had found a rhythm no one could have imagined only a few weeks earlier. Breakfast was no longer served behind closed bedroom doors. Lunch often stretched into quiet conversations beneath the greenhouse windows. Evenings ended with warm tea beside the fireplace instead of silent retreats into separate rooms. The house no longer seemed to wait for people to leave it. It waited for them to gather. One Saturday morning, Adrian returned unexpectedly from a charity board meeting nearly 2 hours ahead of schedule. As he walked through the front entrance, he heard unfamiliar laughter drifting from the kitchen. Curious, he followed the sound instead of heading to his office. The large kitchen table was covered with bowls of fresh vegetables, homemade bread dough, and jars of herbs, while several children from a nearby community center stood on wooden stools, carefully learning how to shape biscuits. Harold sat among them wearing a flour-covered apron that clearly belonged to someone much younger, smiling so broadly that the lines around his eyes seemed to disappear. Zuri moved patiently from one child to another, praising every crooked biscuit as though each one were a masterpiece. "Every loaf tells the story of the hands that made it," she said warmly. "Perfect is never the goal. Sharing is." Adrian remained quietly in the doorway, watching his father laugh as one little boy accidentally dusted flour across his own nose. It had been years since he had heard Harold laugh without restraint. None of the children knew they were standing inside one of the most expensive homes in New York. To them, it was simply a warm kitchen where someone believed they mattered. That afternoon, after the children returned home carrying baskets of fresh bread, Adrian found himself unable to stop thinking about what he had witnessed. Later, he quietly asked Charles about the visit. The elderly butler smiled knowingly. "Miss Carter volunteers every Saturday at the community center. She asked if a few children who had never seen a real greenhouse could spend the morning here. Mr. Harold insisted they stay for lunch." Adrian nodded thoughtfully before driving to the community center later that week without telling anyone. He expected to find a small charity kitchen. Instead, he discovered Zuri teaching senior citizens, single parents, and teenagers how to prepare affordable family meals using simple ingredients. She treated every person with the same quiet respect she offered inside the mansion. Nobody there seemed impressed by her cooking alone. They admired the way she listened. One elderly woman gently took Adrian aside before he could introduce himself. "That young lady sat with my husband every Tuesday until he passed away," she whispered. "She never missed a week, even when nobody knew she was coming." Another volunteer quietly added she was accepted into one of the best culinary schools in the country years ago. She gave it up to care for her adoptive father when he became seriously ill. She never talks about it, because she says family is not a sacrifice. It is a privilege. Adrian stood silently as those words settled inside him. Everything he admired about Zuri had been built long before she ever walked through the gates of his estate. Her kindness was not something she performed. It was simply who she was. That evening, after returning home, Adrian found Zuri sitting alone in the greenhouse, carefully trimming fresh rosemary beneath the soft glow of hanging lanterns. He hesitated before speaking. "You never told me you gave up culinary school." Zuri smiled gently without looking up from the herbs. "Some opportunities arrive twice," she answered quietly. "Some people only need you once." Adrian felt an unfamiliar ache inside his chest. Every achievement in his own life had come from relentless ambition. Yet the woman sitting beside the rosemary had quietly built an extraordinary life by choosing people over success every single time. Looking through the greenhouse windows toward the warmly lit mansion beyond, Adrian realized he was no longer simply grateful that Zuri had changed his father's life. He had begun to wonder how she had quietly started changing his own. The first snow of the season arrived quietly during the final week of November, covering the Montgomery estate in a soft blanket of white that transformed the gardens into a peaceful winter painting. Delicate flakes rested upon the rose bushes Harold had carefully tended each morning, while warm light glowed from every window of the mansion, making the house appear more welcoming than it had in many years. Inside, the familiar aroma of cinnamon, roasted vegetables, and freshly baked bread drifted through the hallways, drawing people toward the kitchen instead of sending them to separate corners of the estate. What had once been the quietest room in the mansion had become its heart. Harold stood beside the kitchen island wearing Eleanor's old apron, laughing softly as he attempted to roll pie dough under Zuri's patient guidance. Flour covered the sleeves of his sweater, and Charles could not hide his smile while watching the scene unfold. Adrian paused outside the doorway before entering, surprised once again by how naturally joy had returned to a place he once believed could never recover from loss. "I think I have officially ruined another pie crust," Harold admitted with playful embarrassment. Zuri laughed gently while placing another handful of flour on the countertop. "There is no such thing as a ruined pie when it is made with someone you love." Harold looked thoughtfully at the dough before quietly saying, "Eleanor used to tell me exactly the same thing." The words settled peacefully over the room, not with sadness but with gratitude. Memories no longer seemed to trap Harold inside the past. They had begun guiding him back toward life. Later that afternoon, a light snowfall encouraged everyone to remain indoors. Adrian found Zuri arranging holiday spices inside the pantry while humming the same gentle tune she often sang during quiet moments in the kitchen. "You always seem to know exactly what this family needs," he said softly. Zuri looked up with her familiar warm smile. "Families usually tell you," she answered. "Most people are simply too busy to listen." Adrian leaned against the doorway, watching her organize small glass jars of cinnamon, rosemary, nutmeg, and thyme. "I spent years believing success meant fixing every problem as quickly as possible," he admitted. "You never seemed to hurry." Zuri closed one of the jars before meeting his eyes. "Some things grow better slowly. Trust is one of them. Families are another." Adrian smiled quietly, realizing those simple words described everything happening inside the estate. Before either of them could continue, Charles entered carrying a small wooden box he had discovered while organizing the attic. "Mr. Harold asked me to bring this to the kitchen," he explained. Harold joined them a few moments later, gently brushing dust from the lid before carefully opening it. Inside rested Eleanor's old handwritten cookbook tied together with a faded blue ribbon. Every page carried careful notes written in elegant script, little reminders beside recipes, and small comments meant only for the people she loved. Harold slowly turned each page until a folded letter slipped onto the table. He stared at it for a long moment before carefully unfolding the yellowed paper. "She wrote this only a few weeks before she passed away," he whispered. His voice trembled gently as he began reading aloud. "If this house ever grows quiet after I am gone, remember that silence is never healed by money. It is healed by someone willing to light the oven, set another place at the table, and remind people that love is something we practice every day." Harold paused, his eyes glistening with emotion. He looked first at Adrian, then toward Zuri. "I thought she was writing about recipes," he said softly. "Now I understand she was writing about people." Adrian felt an unexpected tightness in his chest as he accepted the letter from his father. Looking around the warmly lit kitchen, the steaming kettle, the fresh bread cooling on the counter, and the woman whose quiet kindness had transformed every room she entered, he realized Eleanor had described the very miracle now unfolding before his eyes. Without thinking, he reached out and gently took Zuri's hand for the first time. She looked at him with quiet surprise before returning the gentle gesture, neither of them speaking because no words could express what both had already begun to understand. Outside, snow continued falling across the peaceful gardens while inside the old mansion, love was slowly finding its way back home exactly as Eleanor had always believed it would. December arrived with quiet grace, covering the Montgomery estate in sparkling frost while evergreen wreaths and warm white lights slowly transformed the old mansion into a place that seemed to welcome every person who stepped through its doors. The holiday season had always been Eleanor's favorite time of year, and for the first time since her passing, Harold insisted that every decoration be brought down from the attic exactly as she had once arranged them. The staff moved through the halls with cheerful energy, hanging garlands along the staircase, polishing silver candlesticks, and filling crystal bowls with fresh pine cones and cinnamon sticks whose comforting fragrance drifted through every room. The mansion no longer felt like a museum preserving memories. It felt alive again. One quiet afternoon, Harold asked Adrian and Zuri to join him in the library. The fire crackled softly inside the stone fireplace while snowflakes floated peacefully beyond the tall windows overlooking the garden. Harold carried Eleanor's cookbook beneath one arm and carefully placed it upon the coffee table before taking his favorite chair. He rested his hand gently across the worn leather cover and smiled. "Your mother always believed recipes should never be hidden inside drawers," he said. "She said they only came alive when they were shared." Adrian looked thoughtfully at the familiar cookbook, while Zuri listened with quiet respect. Harold slowly opened the first page, revealing Eleanor's graceful handwriting beside every recipe. Small notes filled the margins. Little reminders about birthdays, family gatherings, favorite desserts, and the people each meal had been prepared for. Finally, Harold reached the last page where another folded sheet of paper rested between the covers. "This was the final letter she wrote to me," he said softly. "I think both of you should hear it." The room became completely still as Harold began reading aloud. "If one day this house grows silent, promise me you will not spend your energy protecting the walls. Protect the people inside them instead. Houses become homes only when someone chooses kindness before pride, listening before speaking, and service before comfort. If our son ever meets the person who brings laughter back into these rooms, remind him that love should never be measured by status, reputation, or wealth. It should be measured by the peace that follows someone through the front door." Harold carefully lowered the letter before looking directly at Adrian. "Your mother trusted that one day you would understand those words." Adrian remained silent for several moments, unable to hide the emotion in his eyes. Every achievement he had earned throughout his career suddenly seemed insignificant beside the quiet wisdom his mother had left behind. He turned toward Zuri, realizing that everything Eleanor described had already begun happening without anyone planning it. Zuri never tried to change the family. She simply chose kindness every day until kindness became contagious. Harold smiled gently as he closed the cookbook. "My greatest fear after Eleanor passed away was not dying alone," he admitted quietly. "It was watching this family forget how to love one another." He reached across the table and rested one weathered hand over Adrian's. Then he placed his other hand over Zuri's. "Now I know that fear is gone." Neither Adrian nor Zuri spoke. Words seemed unnecessary inside the warm glow of the library where every object carried memories of the past, while quietly welcoming the future. As evening settled outside, snow continued falling across the peaceful gardens, and the mansion windows reflected soft golden light into the winter night. Adrian gently looked toward Zuri before saying the simplest sentence he had spoken in many years. "Thank you for bringing my father back to us." Zuri smiled with quiet humility and shook her head softly. "He found his own way back," she answered. "I only helped set the table." Harold laughed warmly, the rich sound filling every corner of the room. It was the same joyful laugh Adrian remembered from childhood, and hearing it again felt like receiving the greatest gift Christmas could ever bring. In that moment, Adrian understood that the true inheritance waiting inside the Montgomery estate had never been its fortune. It had always been the people willing to keep love alive, one shared meal at a time. The weeks leading up to Christmas transformed the Montgomery estate into a place where every corner seemed to breathe with quiet purpose. Fresh evergreen garlands framed the grand staircase. Candles flickered softly across the dining room windows, and the scent of cinnamon, pine, and homemade bread greeted every person who stepped through the front door. Yet the greatest change could not be found in the decorations. It lived in the people themselves. Harold no longer spent his mornings alone. Adrian no longer hurried through breakfast while checking business reports. The household staff no longer whispered through endless hallways. They gathered, they smiled, and they lingered around the kitchen, because that was where life now seemed to begin each day. One crisp December morning, Adrian drove to the community center where he had first learned about Zuri's quiet acts of kindness. Instead of arriving as a wealthy donor, he entered without an announcement, carrying only 2 boxes of fresh produce from the Montgomery greenhouse. The volunteers greeted him warmly, not because of his reputation, but because they had seen him helping unload vegetables several weekends in a row. Zuri looked up from preparing soup for senior citizens and smiled with pleasant surprise. "You are becoming part of the Saturday routine," she said. Adrian laughed softly. "I think I needed a better routine." Together they served lunch to dozens of elderly guests, listening to stories of military service, childhood memories, first loves, and families scattered across the country. Adrian noticed that Zuri remembered every person's favorite meal, every birthday, and every small detail shared during previous visits. She treated each conversation as though it mattered. On the drive back to the estate, he remained unusually quiet. Finally, he spoke. "You have shown me something I never learned in any business school." Zuri glanced toward him with gentle curiosity. "What is that?" Adrian smiled thoughtfully. "Success grows when people feel valued, not when they feel impressed." Those words remained with him long after they returned home. A few days later, Adrian invited Harold and Zuri into the mansion library, where architectural drawings covered the large oak table. Harold adjusted his glasses while studying the plans with quiet curiosity. "What are these?" Adrian looked first at his father, then toward Zuri. "I have been thinking about Mother's letter." He unfolded another set of drawings revealing a renovated building only a few miles from the estate. "I want to turn the old Montgomery carriage house into a community kitchen and dining hall where senior citizens, struggling families, and children can share meals every weekend. I would like it to carry Mother's name." Harold slowly removed his glasses as emotion filled his eyes. "She would have loved that." Adrian then turned toward Zuri. "I cannot imagine anyone better suited to guide it. I would like you to lead the Eleanor Montgomery community table." Zuri remained silent for several moments. She looked at the drawings, then toward the snowy gardens outside the library windows before answering. "I would be honored," she said quietly, "but only if every chair belongs to everyone. No special rooms, no reserved tables, no one turned away because they have less than someone else." Adrian smiled immediately. "That is exactly how I hoped it would be." Harold's face brightened with quiet satisfaction. "Your mother always said the best dinner tables never cared how much money someone carried. They only cared whether there was room for one more plate." The 3 of them spent the rest of the afternoon planning menus, volunteer programs, gardens, and cooking classes for children. Outside, snow continued falling across the peaceful estate, while inside the library, hope quietly took the shape of handwritten notes, shared ideas, and simple dreams. As evening settled over the mansion, Adrian walked Zuri to the front entrance. Neither of them hurried to say goodbye. Standing beneath the warm glow of the porch lights, Adrian looked at her with sincere gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "Not because you changed this house, but because you reminded me what it was always meant to become." Zuri answered with the same quiet smile that had first crossed the grand foyer weeks earlier. "Sometimes a house already knows how to become a home," she replied. "It only needs someone willing to open the kitchen door." Adrian gently reached for her hand once again, and this time neither of them questioned the peaceful certainty that had quietly grown between them, because some promises begin long before anyone dares to speak them aloud. 1 year later, the first Saturday of spring arrived beneath a clear blue sky, and the old Montgomery estate stood with its front gates wide open instead of quietly closed behind polished iron. Morning sunlight poured across the gardens where rows of long wooden tables stretched beneath flowering trees, each one covered with fresh bread, homemade soup, colorful vegetables, and bouquets, gathered from Harold's beloved rose garden. Children laughed while helping volunteers arrange place settings. Elderly neighbors greeted one another with warm embraces. Families from every part of the community walked through the entrance without hesitation, knowing they would always find a welcome waiting inside. The mansion that had once been admired only for its wealth had become known throughout the county for something far more meaningful. Every weekend, the Eleanor Montgomery Community Table served meals to anyone who wished to share them, proving that dignity always belonged at the head of every table. Harold sat comfortably beneath the largest maple tree, wearing Eleanor's favorite green scarf around his neck despite the mild weather. His eyes sparkled with quiet joy as he watched people fill the gardens with conversation and laughter. Every few minutes, someone stopped to thank him for opening the estate to the community, and he answered each compliment with the same gentle smile. The house was always beautiful, he would say. It simply needed more people inside it. Adrian stood nearby, helping carry trays of fresh bread from the kitchen, while Zuri greeted every arriving guest by name whenever she could. The community kitchen she now directed had grown beyond anything either of them imagined. Local farms donated produce each season. Culinary students volunteered beside retired grandparents who shared treasured family recipes with young families. High school musicians performed beneath the gazebo, while children learned to bake biscuits inside the same kitchen that had once echoed only with silence. The old carriage house had become a place where no one asked what someone owned before offering them a seat. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, Charles quietly approached Adrian carrying Eleanor's cookbook wrapped once again in its faded blue ribbon. "Mr. Harold thought it belonged here now," he said. Adrian gently placed the cookbook inside a glass display near the entrance to the community kitchen. Beside it rested a small plaque engraved with Eleanor's final words. "Protect the people inside the house, and the house will always find its way home." Visitors paused to read the message before continuing inside, many smiling through quiet tears. Later that evening, after the final guests had departed and the last table had been cleared, the gardens settled into peaceful silence once more. Adrian and Zuri walked slowly through the rose garden where fresh blossoms swayed gently beneath the warm spring breeze. Harold remained on the porch watching them with quiet contentment, recognizing the same peaceful happiness he had once shared with Eleanor many years before. Adrian stopped beside the old stone bench overlooking the Hudson River. "I used to believe this estate was the greatest thing my family would ever leave behind," he said softly. "Now I know it was never the house." Zuri looked toward the warmly lit windows where laughter had finally replaced loneliness. "Homes are remembered because of the people who filled them," she answered. Adrian smiled before reaching gently for both of her hands. "Will you keep filling this one with me?" Zuri's eyes glistened with quiet happiness as she nodded. "Every single day." Adrian leaned forward and shared a tender kiss with her beneath the flowering branches, a simple promise built upon gratitude, respect, and the quiet love that had grown one shared meal at a time. From the porch, Harold applauded with joyful laughter while Charles smiled warmly beside him. The lights inside the mansion glowed softly against the evening sky, welcoming another family gathering already planned for the following weekend. As darkness settled peacefully across the estate, the old mansion no longer stood as a symbol of fortune or status. It stood as living proof that the richest legacy any person can leave behind is not measured by the size of a house, but by the number of hearts that always feel welcome when its door is open. Because in the end, the greatest recipe was never written inside a cookbook. It was written in every act of kindness shared around a table where love always made room for one more chair.